The first thing I noticed was the man standing in my living room, not sitting, not waiting politely near the door, standing in the middle of the room, slowly looking around my house like he was trying to imagine where his furniture might go. For a moment, I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong place, because nothing about what I was seeing made sense. The curtains were mine, the photographs on the wall were mine, the couch he was casually leaning against was the same one I bought 12 years ago when my husband and I finally finished paying off the mortgage. And yet there he was, a complete stranger, inside my house, examining it. I stood in the doorway for several seconds without saying anything. My keys were still in my hand. The grocery bag was slipping slowly down my arm because I had forgotten I was holding it. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said. The man turned around. He looked completely calm, not startled, not embarrassed, just mildly surprised that I had appeared so suddenly. "Oh," he said politely, "you must be the owner." The owner. That word should have made the situation simple. "Yes," I replied, "I am." He nodded once and walked toward the kitchen, glancing at the cabinets as he passed. "Great," he said. "I just needed to take a quick look before closing." Before closing? For a second, I wondered if I had misheard him. "Closing what?" I asked. He stopped walking. Then he looked back at me with the kind of expression someone gives when they assume the other person already understands something. "The house," he said. My stomach tightened immediately. "What about the house?" He seemed confused now. "The sale," he replied. "Your son told us everything was finalized." Everything was finalized. Those words didn't just confuse me, they rearranged the entire moment. Because I had lived in that house for 27 years. Every payment, every repair, every tax bill. My name was on every document connected to that property. And yet this man was standing inside my living room talking about buying it. "I think you're mistaken," I said slowly. But he didn't look mistaken. He reached into the folder he was holding and pulled out a few papers. "Well," he said carefully, "this is the address." He showed me the document. The address was correct. My house, my living room, my life, all written clearly across the top of the page. "That's my house," I said. "Yes," he replied, "the one your son sold." Sold? The word landed in the room like a heavy object. My son did what? The man's confident expression started fading. He looked at the document again, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said cautiously. "You didn't know?" "Know what?" I could feel something cold moving through my chest now, because there are certain moments when the brain realizes a situation is much worse than it first appeared. This was one of those moments. "My son doesn't own this house," I said. "Well, according to the listing documents, he was the seller." The seller. I set the grocery bag down on the kitchen counter because my hand had started shaking slightly. "That's impossible," I said. He hesitated before speaking again. "Look," he said gently, "maybe this is just a misunderstanding between you and your son." A misunderstanding. I wish that was all it had been, because misunderstandings can be fixed with conversations. But what I was about to discover was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan that had already moved much further than I realized. "Who gave you the key?" I asked. "My real estate agent. Your son arranged the showing." The room suddenly felt smaller. Because my son had a key. Of course he did. He grew up in this house. He learned to walk across the hardwood floors. He used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I cooked dinner. And yet somehow that same boy had just sold the house without telling me. Or at least that's what this stranger believed. "I think you should leave," I said. He nodded quickly. Yes, of course. He gathered the papers and moved toward the door. But before he stepped outside, he turned back toward me. "Just so you know," he said carefully, "the closing is scheduled for next week." Next week? Then he left. The front door closed quietly behind me. And for several seconds, I just stood there staring at the same living room I had been standing in for years. Nothing looked different, but everything suddenly felt uncertain. So I did the only thing that made sense. I picked up the phone and I called my son. He answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mom," he said casually, as if nothing in the world had changed, as if a stranger had just walked through my house talking about buying it. "Daniel," I said slowly. "Yes?" There was a long pause on the other end of the phone, long enough for me to hear his breathing, long enough for me to realize something very important. He wasn't surprised by the question. He was surprised that I had found out. And when he finally spoke again,
he said something that made the situation even worse. "Mom," he said quietly, "you weren't supposed to hear about that yet." That was the moment I realized something terrifying. My son really believed he had sold my house, but there was one detail he clearly didn't understand, a detail written clearly on the deed itself, and that mistake was about to destroy his entire plan. When my son said those words, the room suddenly felt colder. You weren't supposed to hear about that yet. Not surprised, not confused, not denying it, just inconvenience, like I had accidentally discovered a surprise party too early. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, still holding the phone. "Daniel," I said quietly, "what exactly did you mean by that?" There was another pause. I could hear something in the background on his end, a car door closing, his voice lowered slightly like he had stepped away from someone. "Mom," he said carefully, "it's not what you think." That sentence usually means the opposite. "It sounds like my house was just sold." "No," he said quickly, "it's just paperwork." Paperwork. Funny how people use that word when they are trying to make something complicated sound harmless. "What paperwork sells a house, Daniel?" He didn't answer that question directly. Instead, he said something that immediately brought back a memory from a few months earlier. "You remember we talked about the property situation," he said. The property situation. Yes, I remembered, because the first time he brought it up, it had seemed so ordinary. It was a Sunday afternoon. He had come over for dinner with his wife, Melissa. The three of us were sitting at the dining table after we finished eating. Melissa had brought dessert, and Daniel was unusually quiet. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Mom, have you thought about what you're going to do with the house long term?" I laughed at the time. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well," he said casually, "it's a big place for one person." That wasn't a strange comment. People say that kind of thing all the time. My husband had passed away 5 years earlier, and many people assumed that meant I should eventually move somewhere smaller. But I liked my house. Every corner of it carried a memory. "I'm doing just fine here," I told him. Melissa smiled politely from across the table, but she didn't say anything. Daniel nodded slowly. "Of course," he said, "I just meant financially." Financially?
Taxes, he explained, property management, future planning. Future planning. The word sounded responsible, concerned, like a son trying to help his mother think ahead. At least, that's how it sounded then. Mom, Daniel continued that evening, there are ways to simplify things. Like what? Well, he said, sometimes parents transfer property to their kids so everything is easier later. I remember staring at him for a moment. Later? I asked. Yes, he said quickly, just planning. Planning. I shrugged it off. Daniel, I told him, this house is already paid for. I don't need help managing it. Melissa finally spoke then. It's not about help, it's about security. Security. That word sounded nice, comforting. But looking back now, I realized something. Melissa was the one watching me the most carefully during that conversation, not Daniel, her. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Mom, we're just trying to make things easier for you. I appreciate that, but I'm not going anywhere. He nodded again. Of course not. And that was where the conversation ended, or at least where I thought it ended, because over the next few weeks, Daniel started asking more questions, small questions at first. Where do you keep the property documents? Do you still have the original deed? Did Dad ever update the title paperwork? At the time, those questions didn't alarm me. He was my son. I trusted him. If anything, I assumed he was trying to understand things so he could help if I ever needed it. But there was one moment that felt slightly strange. One afternoon, he asked something very specific. Mom, is your name the only one on the deed? I looked up from the newspaper. Yes. Just you? Yes. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. Good. At the time, that word didn't bother me. Now it does, because I realized something. That conversation wasn't about helping me. It was about gathering information, about learning exactly how much control he had. And then, about 2 weeks after that dinner, Daniel showed up at my house carrying a folder. Mom, he said casually, placing it on the table, I brought those papers we talked about. What papers? The property planning forms. Forms. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were several legal documents.
And that was the moment something inside me became cautious. Daniel, I said, what exactly is this? Oh, it's simple, he replied quickly. Just a way to organize the property for the future. The future. He handed me a pen. You can sign them whenever you're ready. I didn't touch the pen. I'll read them first, I said. He smiled. Of course. But the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And as I sat there looking at those documents, I had no idea that the papers were sitting on my table that afternoon were the beginning of the plan that would eventually lead to a stranger walking through my living room. And what I didn't realize yet was that someone had already decided those papers would be signed. The folder Daniel placed on my kitchen table looked ordinary, just a thin brown envelope. Nothing about it suggested that it would eventually bring strangers into my home and police into my living room. Inside were several pages of legal forms, property transfer language, ownership terminology, lines waiting for signatures, my signature. I flipped through the pages slowly while Daniel stood beside the table, pretending to study the photos on the wall. Melissa sat quietly across from me, her hands folded together like she was waiting for something to happen. What exactly do these do? I asked. Daniel answered quickly. It's just future planning. That phrase again, future planning. They make taxes easier later, he continued, and they avoid complications if anything ever happens. I read a few more lines. The wording was careful, technical, but one thing was very clear.
These papers would give Daniel ownership rights to the house, not later, now. I placed the papers back on the table. "I'm not signing this today," I said. Daniel didn't react right away. Melissa did. "Oh, there's no rush," she said gently. Her voice was soft, but something about it felt practiced. "I just want to read everything properly," I explained. Daniel nodded. Of course, but his tone had changed slightly, less relaxed, more controlled. "You trust me, right, Mom?" he added. Trust, that word always sounds simple until someone uses it as pressure. "I do," I said calmly, "but I also trust reading documents before signing them." Melissa laughed lightly. "That's smart." But again, her eyes stayed fixed on the papers, almost like she was hoping my answer would change. I closed the folder and slid it back toward Daniel. "I'll look at them later," I said. "Take your time," he replied. But when he picked up the envelope, I noticed something strange. He hesitated, just for a second, like he had expected a different outcome. They left shortly after that, and the folder left with them. At the time, I assumed that was the end of it, a conversation about planning, a set of papers that might come up again someday. But over the next week, Daniel started asking about them. At first, it was casual. "Did you get a chance to read the forms?" "Not yet," I said. Then a few days later, he asked again, "Mom, what did you think about the paperwork?" "I haven't finished reviewing it." Then Melissa called. That surprised me, because she almost never called me directly. "Hi," she said pleasantly. "I just wanted to check if Daniel's documents made sense." "They made sense, I just haven't decided anything." "Oh," she replied. "Well, there's no rush." But again, her voice carried something else, expectation, like she believed the decision had already been made. After that conversation, the subject disappeared for a while, at least on the surface. Daniel stopped bringing it up. Melissa stopped calling about it. Everything returned to normal, or so I believed, until one evening when my neighbor Carol knocked on my door. Carol has lived across the street for nearly 20 years. She's the kind of neighbor who notices everything. "Have you seen it?" she asked. "Seen what?" I replied. "The listing." "What listing?" She looked confused. "Your house." For a second, I thought she was joking. "My house isn't listed." "Well," she said slowly, "there's a house on Maple Ridge Drive with your exact address online." My stomach tightened. "That's impossible." She pulled out her phone and opened a real estate website.
Then she handed it to me. There it was, my house, my front porch, my driveway, the garden I planted 6 years ago, all displayed in bright real estate photographs. Below the photos were words that made the situation suddenly feel unreal. For sale. And under the listing information, the seller's name, Daniel Harper, my son, the same son who had asked me to sign future planning papers 2 weeks earlier. For several seconds, I just stared at the screen, trying to understand what I was looking at. "Maybe it's a mistake," Carol said. Maybe. But something deep inside me already knew the truth, because the photographs in that listing were not taken by accident. Someone had scheduled them. Someone had approved them. Someone had created the listing. And according to the information on the page, the first buyer showing was scheduled for the following week. I handed the phone back to Carol slowly. "Thank you for telling me," I said. She nodded. "You might want to call your son." "Call my son." Yes, I probably should have, but something told me to wait, to watch, to see what happened next. Because if my son believed he could sell my house without telling me, then I needed to understand exactly how far he thought this plan would go. What I didn't expect was that I would find out sooner than anyone planned. because the very first buyer scheduled to see the property didn't wait for next week. He showed up at my front door, and that was the stranger I found standing in my living room earlier that afternoon. The stranger who believed my house already belonged to him. But what none of them realized yet was that one small detail on the deed would stop everything, and that detail had my name written clearly across it. After Carol showed me the listing on her phone, I spent the rest of that evening sitting in my living room trying to understand what I had just seen. My house, photographed, described, priced, presented to strangers like it was something ready to be handed over, and the name under the seller's information wasn't mine, it was Daniel's. I opened my laptop and searched for the listing myself. It didn't take long to find it. There it was again, the same pictures, the same description. Charming family home in a quiet neighborhood, recently maintained. Move-in ready. Move-in ready. That phrase stayed with me, because according to the listing, someone could move into my house within weeks. Weeks. As if the life I had built inside those walls could simply be scheduled for removal. I studied the photos more closely. They had clearly been taken recently. The flowers in the front garden were blooming. The kitchen counters were exactly the way I keep them, which meant something very simple. Someone had entered my home and taken those photographs without telling me, without asking me, without even pretending to explain. I leaned back in my chair and tried to piece together the situation. Daniel had brought paperwork. I had refused to sign it, and yet somehow the house had been listed for sale anyway, which meant either my son had made a terrible assumption or someone had decided my signature was not necessary. Neither possibility felt good. The next morning, I called Daniel. He answered quickly. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded normal, too normal. "Daniel," I said calmly, "why is my house listed for sale?" There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Oh," he said, "you saw that." I saw that.
Yes, I replied. Well, he said carefully, it's just preliminary. Preliminary? I asked. We're exploring options. That word again. We. I'm not exploring anything, I said. It's not like that, he replied quickly. Then explain it to me. He sighed. Mom, the market is really good right now. The market. Just like that, my house had become an investment. You don't sell someone else's house because the market is good, I said. You agreed we should plan ahead, he replied. No, I said firmly, I agreed to read paperwork. He didn't deny it. He didn't say it was a mistake. He simply tried to justify it. We were just getting things ready, he said. Ready for what? I asked. For a transition. Transition. People use soft words when they want to hide hard decisions. I'm not transitioning anywhere, I said. You will eventually, and when that happens, this process will already be finished. Finished. He really believed he was helping, or at least that's what he told himself. But helping someone means telling them what you're doing, not hiding it. Take the listing down, I said. We'll talk about it, he replied. And then he ended the call. No apology, no explanation, just a promise. And promises like that usually mean nothing will change, and nothing did. The listing stayed online.
Day after day, more photos appeared. A virtual tour was added. Even the price was adjusted. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was a real sale. 3 days later, Carol knocked on my door again. "You're not going to like this," she said. "What now?" I asked. She handed me her phone. There was an update on the listing. An open house. For my house. A house I was still living in. That was when it became clear. Daniel and Melissa weren't exploring anything. They were moving forward, and they were doing it without me. Buyers were already calling. Agents were scheduling showings, and one of them didn't wait. He came early, unannounced, and that was the man I found standing in my living room. The man who believed the house already belonged to him. But what he didn't know, what Daniel didn't know, what Melissa didn't expect, was that there was one detail on the property deed that would stop everything. A detail that meant my house could never be transferred without me. And that discovery was about to change everything. After the man left, the house became quiet again. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy. I stood in the kitchen staring at the front door, because there is something deeply unsettling about realizing strangers believe they have the right to walk through your home, a home you never agreed to sell. I sat down slowly and opened the listing again. Everything looked professional. The photos, the description, the pricing. Nothing looked like a mistake. This wasn't someone testing the market. This was a house being sold. My house. And according to the man who had just walked through my living room, the closing was already scheduled. And that word stayed in my mind. Closing. Because closing means something very specific. It means contracts. It means lawyers. It means someone believes the deal is already done. Contracts, agreements, money, which meant somewhere out there paperwork existed claiming my house had been sold. I picked up my phone again and called Daniel. This time he didn't answer. It rang until voicemail. "Daniel," I said when the recording started, "I just had a man walk through my house because he believes he bought it." I paused. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding, you need to call me back immediately." I hung up and placed the phone on the table. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. No response. And that was when something strange happened. The doorbell rang. Again. For a second, I simply stared at the door, because part of me already knew what I was going to find on the other side. When I opened it, there were 2 people standing on the porch, a man in a suit and a woman holding a clipboard. The woman smiled politely. "Hello," she said. "We're here for the showing." "The showing?" "Yes," the man added. "Your son said today would be fine." I felt the same cold sensation in my chest that I had felt earlier. Another buyer, another stranger, another person who believed my house was already available. "I'm sorry," I said calmly. "There must be some confusion." The woman glanced down at her clipboard. "No," she said. "The appointment was confirmed this morning." "Confirmed? By who?" I asked. "Daniel Harper." My son. Of course. The man looked slightly uncomfortable. "We drove 2 hours to see this property," he said. "I understand," I replied, "but the house is not for sale." The 2 of them exchanged confused looks. "That's not what the listing says," the woman replied. She opened her tablet and turned the screen toward me. There it was again. My house. The same listing. The same photos. The same seller. Daniel Harper. "This information is incorrect," I said firmly. The woman frowned slightly. "Well, we were told the owner had already moved out." Moved out? I almost laughed. "I'm the owner," I said, "and as you can see, I'm still living here." The man stepped back slightly, clearly realizing the situation was becoming uncomfortable. "Maybe we should contact the agent," he said. "Yes," the woman agreed. She stepped aside and began making a phone call. While she spoke quietly on the porch, the man looked at me apologetically. "I'm sorry," he said. "We had no idea." "It's not your fault," I replied. A few minutes later, the woman ended the call. Her expression had changed. "Your son told the agent everything was finalized," she said carefully. Finalized? The word felt heavier now, because it meant Daniel had convinced other people that the house already belonged to him. "That's not possible," I said. "Well," she continued, "the agent said the deed transfer paperwork had already been filed." Filed? That word stopped me, because filing paperwork means something very specific. It means documents have been submitted to the county, official records, legal records, and if Daniel had actually filed something, then there was only one way to find out exactly what he had done. "Thank you for coming," I said gently, "but I think you should leave." They nodded quickly. Within a few minutes, the porch was empty again. The street returned to its normal quiet, but the situation inside my house had changed completely. Because now I know something important. Daniel hadn't just talked about selling the house. He had taken legal steps to try to make it happen. And if he had filed paperwork with the county, then somewhere inside those documents would be the answer to the question that mattered most. How did my son believe he had the right to sell my house? So I walked to the hallway cabinet. I opened the drawer where I kept the original property documents and pulled out the folder. The deed, the title records, every document connected to the house. I placed the papers on the table and began reading them again carefully, line by line, word by word. Because if Daniel had truly tried to sell the house, then somewhere in those documents would be the detail that either proved he was right or proved he had made a very serious mistake. And it didn't take long for me to find it, because printed clearly on the deed, in bold legal language, were 3 words that Daniel had clearly overlooked. Sole legal owner. My name. Not his. Mine. No matter what story he had told the real estate agent, there was no way to legally transfer that property without my signature, and I had never signed a single thing. After the second buyer left my porch, the house felt strangely quiet again, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was the kind of silence that comes when something serious is about to unfold. I sat at the kitchen table and spread the property documents out in front of me. The folder had been sitting in that hallway drawer for years. I rarely opened it because I never needed to. The house had been paying off more than a decade ago. Every payment, every tax bill, every repair, handled, finished, so the documents had simply stayed there, untouched, until that afternoon. I began reading carefully, not quickly, slowly, line by line, because if Daniel had actually filed something with the county, then I needed to understand exactly what he thought he had done. The original deed was still the first document in the folder. Heavy paper, county seal, my name printed clearly across the top. Owner of record, just me. No secondary names, no shared ownership, just me. That detail had seemed normal for years. Now it suddenly felt very important. Because in order for Daniel to sell the house legally, one thing would have to exist: a transfer, a document showing that I had given him ownership. Without that, the house could not legally belong to him, which meant the next question was simple. What exactly had he filed? I opened my laptop and searched the county property records website. Every property transaction eventually appears there: sales, transfers, title changes. It took a few minutes to navigate the site. Then I entered the address, my address, and something immediately appeared on the screen. A new filing, dated that morning. My stomach tightened slightly as I clicked on it, because if Daniel had truly tried to transfer the house into his name, then whatever he had filed would be right there. The document opened slowly. Page 1, Property Transfer Declaration. Page 2, Ownership Assignment. Page 3, Signature page. I stared at the screen for a long time because the name on the seller line was exactly what I expected: Daniel Harper, my son. The buyer line was blank, which meant the property was being transferred to him first before any final sale. A very simple strategy: transfer ownership to himself, then sell the house to someone else. Except for one problem, a very big problem. The seller line listed Daniel, but the current owner listed me, which meant the document required something very specific: my signature. And there it was, at the bottom of the page, a signature that was supposed to be mine. I leaned closer to the screen because the name written there looked almost right. Almost. The letters were similar, the style was close, but something about it felt wrong. The curves were different, the spacing between the letters was off. It looked like someone had tried to copy my signature, but didn't quite understand how I actually wrote it. And then I noticed something else. Under the signature line was a notary stamp, official seal, date, location. That meant whoever created this document had tried to make it look legitimate, official, legal, final. But they had overlooked one very simple fact. I had never been to that notary office. Not yesterday, not last week, not ever. Which meant something extremely serious had happened. Someone had signed my name to a legal document without my permission. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly, because at that moment the situation stopped being confusing, it stopped being a misunderstanding, and it became something else entirely: forgery. I picked up the phone and called Daniel again. This time he answered. "Mom," his voice sounded cautious now, "you filed property transfer documents this morning." There was a long pause. Then he replied, "Yes." "You signed my name." Another pause.
It was already agreed, he said. No apology, no explanation, just justification. I never signed anything, I replied. You said you were going to, he said. That is not the same thing. Silence again. Then he said something that made the situation even clearer. Melissa handled the paperwork. Melissa, my daughter-in-law. The same person who had watched me so carefully at the dinner table weeks earlier. The same person who had smiled while those documents sat in front of me.
You filed a document with a forged signature, I said calmly. It's not forged, he replied quickly. You approved it. No, I said firmly, I didn't. He exhaled sharply on the other end of the phone. Mom, you're overreacting. Overreacting? That word almost made me laugh, because according to the county records, my house had just been transferred into his name, and buyers were already walking through the property believing the sale was real. You need to come here, I said. Why? Because there are strangers trying to move into my house. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, I'll come by later. Later. That word told me everything, because Daniel still believed the paperwork he filed was enough. He still believed the house was already his. What he didn't understand yet was that the signature on that document wasn't just a mistake, it was evidence. And the moment the county reviewed it closely, this situation was going to become much more serious than a family disagreement. But even more surprising was the mistake Melissa had made with the notary stamp, a mistake that would make the entire document impossible to defend. And once that was discovered, the house sale wouldn't just collapse. By the time Daniel finally arrived at the house, the sun had already started setting. I was still sitting at the kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me. The deed, the county filing, the forged signature, everything laid out clearly where anyone could see it. When his car pulled into the driveway, I didn't move. I simply waited. A moment later, the front door opened and Daniel stepped inside. Melissa followed behind him. Neither of them said hello. Daniel looked at the papers on the table first. Then he looked at me. You didn't have to make this a big deal, he said. A big deal. I folded my hands calmly. A man walked into my living room today, I replied. He believed he bought my house. Daniel sighed. That was just a show. No, I said, that was a buyer. Melissa stepped forward quickly. Look, everyone is overreacting. Overreacting. That word again. I picked up the printed copy of the county filing and slid it across the table. Do you recognize this? I asked. Daniel glanced at it briefly. Yes. Melissa didn't touch it. You filed this today, I continued. Yes, he said. You signed my name. It was already agreed, he repeated. That sentence seemed to be the only defense he had prepared. I leaned forward slightly. No, I said quietly, it wasn't. Daniel's expression hardened. You said you would sign eventually. That does not mean you sign for me. Melissa finally picked up the paper and looked at it. Her eyes moved across the page quickly. Then she placed it back down. You're focusing on the wrong thing, she said. The house was going to be transferred anyway. Going to be. Those words were revealing. You decided that, I replied. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Mom, we were trying to help. Help? You tried to sell my house. It's a good time to sell, he said quickly. That doesn't make it yours. Melissa crossed her arms. You can't maintain this place forever. That sentence hung in the air for a moment, because it wasn't about paperwork, it was about control. I'm maintaining it just fine, I said. But you won't always be able to, she replied. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Melissa, he said quietly, but she continued. We were thinking long term. You were thinking for me, I corrected. Daniel picked up the document again. This is already filed, I replied. Yes, it is. And the sale is already scheduled. I know. He looked confused by my calm tone,
because Daniel still believed the paperwork made the situation final, that once something was filed with the county, it couldn't be undone. But he had overlooked one very important detail, a detail printed clearly on the page he was holding. "You should read the bottom section," I said. He glanced down. "Why?" "Just read it." He followed the text slowly until he reached the signature area. Then his eyes stopped, because right below the signature line was the notary stamp, official, stamped, dated. Melissa noticed it too. "Yes," she said quickly, "that makes it legal." "No," I said, "it makes it suspicious." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" I turned the laptop screen toward them and pulled up the county property website. Then I clicked on the notary registry. "Because that stamp number," I explained calmly, "belongs to a notary office across town." Melissa didn't speak. "And yesterday evening," I continued, "I was eating dinner with my sister." Daniel looked up at me. "So?" "So," I said, "I couldn't possibly have been at that office signing this document." The room became very quiet. Melissa's expression changed first. "Don't panic, not yet, but uncertainty." Daniel looked back down at the paper again. "Maybe the date is wrong," he said. "No," I replied, "the date is correct." Melissa stepped forward suddenly. "You're making this sound worse than it is." "I'm not making it anything," I said. "The document already did that." Daniel stared at the signature again. "You told me she signed it," he said to Melissa. Melissa shook her head quickly. "She agreed." "That's not the same thing. She said she would do it eventually." "So you signed it?" "I was fixing the paperwork." Daniel stared at her. "You forged my mother's signature." "I was helping you," she insisted. "You said you wanted the house." Daniel ran his hands through his hair. "That's not how this works." The entire room had shifted now, because the plan they had quietly constructed over the past few weeks had finally collided with reality. "You filed a legal document with a forged signature," I said calmly. Daniel looked at the paper again. For the first time that evening, he looked worried, not about the house, about the consequences. Because the moment the county reviewed that document closely, the problem would no longer be family disagreement. It would become legal evidence. And that was when the doorbell rang. Again. But this time, it wasn't a buyer. It was someone who had already started reviewing the paperwork Daniel filed earlier that morning, and they had questions. The doorbell rang again, but this time no one moved right away. Daniel was still staring at the document in his hands. Melissa stood beside the table, her arms folded tightly, like she was trying to hold the situation together. And I remained seated in my chair, watching both of them quietly. The doorbell rang a second time. Daniel finally looked toward the hallway. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. "No," I replied, but something told me exactly who it might be. Because once paperwork is filed with the county, it doesn't just disappear into a drawer. Someone reviews it. Someone checks it. Someone eventually asks questions. Daniel walked slowly toward the door and opened it. A man and a woman were standing on the porch, both holding folders, both dressed like people who deal with documents for a living. "Good evening," the man said politely. "Is Daniel Harper here?" Daniel hesitated. "That's me." The man nodded. "My name is Thomas Riley. I'm with the county recorder's office." The room went completely still. Daniel stepped aside slowly as they entered the house. "We received a notification regarding the transfer form filed submitted earlier today." Melissa spoke quickly. "That's already been handled." The woman beside him opened her folder. "That's what we're here to confirm." Daniel looked confused. "Confirm what?" The man placed a copy of the document on the kitchen table. "This transfer form contains a notary stamp that has already been flagged."
Flagged? Melissa's face went pale. What do you mean, flagged? Daniel asked. The woman answered calmly. The notary number used on this document does not belong to the office listed. Daniel looked from the document to Melissa. What does that mean? It means, the man explained carefully, the notarization may be fraudulent. The word hung in the air like something heavy. Fraudulent. Melissa shook her head quickly. That's not possible. The woman slid another document across the table. This is the official record for that notary stamp. Daniel compared the numbers. They were different. Completely different. How did this happen? He asked quietly. Melissa looked at the table. I thought the stamp was real, she said. You thought? Daniel repeated. The website said it was official. Daniel stared at her. You ordered a stamp from a website? I was trying to finish the paperwork, she replied quickly. Daniel's voice rose. By forging it? I wasn't forging it. The man from the county raised his hand calmly. Let's slow down. The room fell silent again. He continued speaking in the same steady tone. When a property transfer includes a questionable signature and an invalid notary stamp, the filing cannot be processed. Daniel looked up. So what happens now? The woman answered. The transfer is invalid. Invalid. One word, but it carried the weight of the entire situation. The house sale, the listing, the buyers, everything built on that document, gone. Melissa stepped back slightly. That doesn't make sense, she said. The man nodded. It makes legal sense. He tapped the original deed sitting on the table. The property remains in the name of the current owner. His eyes moved toward me. Daniel followed his gaze. And for the first time that evening, he truly understood what had happened. The house had never been his. The sale had never been real. The plan had collapsed before it even began. And now there were official records showing exactly how it happened. Daniel slowly lowered himself into a chair. This was supposed to help, he said quietly. Melissa said nothing, because the truth was already written across the documents in front of us. The man from the county gathered his papers. This situation will remain on file, but for now, the property remains exactly where it was before. He closed the folder, with the legal owner. Then he looked at me again, which is you. The two officials left a few minutes later. The front door closed softly behind them, and suddenly the house felt very quiet again. Daniel remained at the kitchen table, staring at the paperwork that had just destroyed the entire plan. Melissa stood near the hallway window, staring outside like she was hoping the situation might somehow reverse itself. But nothing was going to change. The truth had already been written into the record, and once something enters the official record, it tends to stay there. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was quieter now. I didn't think it would turn out like this. I looked at him for a long moment, because the boy I raised was still there somewhere inside the man sitting at my kitchen table. But something else had grown around him over the years, something that believed shortcuts were easier than honesty. You didn't think it through, I said calmly. He nodded slowly. I thought we were helping. Helping. I had heard that word several times that day, but help usually doesn't involve forged signatures. Help doesn't involve selling someone's home behind their back. Melissa finally turned away from the window. We were thinking about the future, she said quietly. No, I replied. You were deciding it for me. Daniel rubbed his hands nervously. The buyers are going to be angry. They should be, because they were lied to. Melissa lowered her head. For the first time since the afternoon began, she didn't try to defend the situation. There was nothing left to defend. The house sale had been erased the moment the county rejected the transfer. The listing would have to be removed, the buyers would have to be contacted, and the entire situation would now exist in official records. Daniel slowly stood up from the table. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. It was the first honest question he had asked all evening. I looked around the room for a moment before answering. The same living room, the same kitchen, the same walls that had watched my family grow for nearly 3 decades. "This house stays exactly where it is," I said. He nodded. "I understand. But understanding something and accepting it are two very different things." Daniel picked up the envelope containing the rejected paperwork. For a moment, I thought he might say something else, maybe apologize, maybe explain. But instead, he simply held the envelope quietly. Melissa moved toward the door. Neither of them seemed eager to stay any longer, because the house they thought they controlled no longer belonged to their plan. It belonged to the truth. Daniel paused before leaving. "Mom," he said. "Yes?" I really thought I was doing the right thing. I studied his face carefully, because sometimes people convince themselves that control is the same thing as protection. "It would have been the right thing," I said calmly, "if you had asked." He nodded once. Then he and Melissa walked out the front door. Their car pulled away from the driveway a few minutes later, and just like that, the house was quiet again. I walked slowly through the living room and into the kitchen. The same cup of tea I had made earlier that afternoon was still sitting on the counter. It's cold now. I poured another one. Then I sat down by the window. The street outside looked exactly the same as it always had. Neighbors walking their dogs, cars passing. Evening lights are beginning to appear in the houses down the block. Life is moving forward. Because that is the strange thing about betrayal. It feels like the end of something, but very often it simply reveals what was always there: trust, boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to protect what belongs to you. My son believed he could sell my house behind my back. He believed the paperwork would erase my place inside it. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most carefully planned shortcuts, because in the end, the only name that mattered was the one written clearly on the deed, mine. And this house had never stopped being my home. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that dignity and self-respect still matter, then stay here with this space. There are many more stories like this, stories about family, about betrayal, about resilience, and about the quiet power of standing your ground. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is to make sure these stories are heard.